maybe learn how to cook. None of these things are ever going to happen, of course, which is exactly the same with Google paying their taxes as things stand. Now, whilst low-paid workers and unemployed people and disabled people are having their benefits stripped away from them, there's no money left, as we all know, apparently. The likes of Google, who are booming away, are paying derisory amounts of tax. From 2007 onwards, they had nearly £12 billion worth of revenues. They paid a whacking big £10 million of that in corporation tax. Now, the way they do that is they register their UK sales in Ireland, or so they pay no tax there. Amazon.co.uk is a British company. The clue there is it's called Amazon.co.uk. It's a pretty big clue. So what they've done is they routed their profits through Switzerland and used foreign entities to make it look like they're not making any money here. So they've paid, of their £4.2 billion worth of sales, £4.2 billion worth of sales in this country, they've paid £2.4 million worth of tax. And the truth is this: if you're rich, life just becomes cheaper. You can afford an army of accountants and lawyers who will literally hunt down every possible loophole imaginable under the sun, if you like. And what's interesting about this is the objection you'll always get then is, well, this isn't illegal, this is the law. They're just exploiting legal loopholes. And that's absolutely right. And that's what makes it worse, because the law is rigged in favour of the wealthy and powerful. So whilst, if you like, the law is there to be exploited by the rich, if you are on benefits and you end up with, I don't know, £50 cash in hand, that's game over. The old bill will come and visit you. The state will come down on you like a ton of bricks. But the difference is, not only is the state there available, this is another example of how they're allowed to get away with it. Accountants that service these companies, like PricewaterhouseCoopers and Deloitte, get their team seconded to the Treasury, draw up the tax laws, then go back to their clients and tell them how to get around the tax laws they themselves have drawn up. I mean, it's remarkable. I mean, you have to almost admire their absolute chutzpah, but this is what they do. This is their systematic rigging of the state, if you like, in their own interests. Now, what they always come back and say, these sorts of companies, oh, come on, give us a break, we employ people, don't we? I mean, they think they're a big charity or something. But the reality is this is why it's scrounging. I want to go through quickly why this is scrounging. Because some will say, well, actually, look, it's not like they're in receipt of money and they're just, receipt of money they're falsely claiming as a benefit scrounging would be doing. This is why the state is there to enable them to make huge amounts of money, without which they wouldn't be able to do so. Now, one reason for this, and this is something the economist Ha-Joon Chang, some of you will be familiar with his work, has looked at. So firstly, a basic thing the state does is protect property rights for these large companies. That's through the police and the courts, limited liabilities, they have bankruptcy protection. Now, in the 18th century, in the early days of capitalism, if you went bankrupt, then you'd have to sell everything you own in order to pay off your debts. And if you couldn't afford to pay them back, you'd end up in a debtor's prison. Now, what we have now is the state caps the downside risk for those investors, and that allows them to make a lot more money than they would otherwise without those rules being there in the first place. They have patent law, intellectual property rights. That stops ideas being ripped off by other companies, other products being cut off, whether it be a chemical formula or something you've invented. At the same time, these companies benefit from huge amounts of government-funded research and development. Now, the internet is a really good example of that. You'd think Google would be a bit more appreciative, because the internet is a public sector creation. It was made at taxpayers' expense. Some of you may have chips. Some of you got iPhones. The chips in these iPhones were again created at the expense of the public sector. It was scientific research at taxpayers' expense which created it. At the same time, companies depend on state-funded infrastructure like roads or railways, which they wouldn't be able to function without either. State-provided education. Now, many of the rich, the wealthiest in society, will have opted out of state-funded education. They send their kids to private school. But they depend on state-run education to have a properly educated workforce, without which they wouldn't be able to run their companies. It's the same with healthcare. They probably don't want all their workers dying of preventable illnesses. you'd imagine. So they depend on that as well. So all of these things, if you like, are huge amounts of taxpayers' money invested in all of these things, without which these companies just wouldn't be able to function. So when they end up paying almost no tax whatsoever, they're scrounging because they're dependent on huge amounts of taxpayers' money. Now this is a sort of an idea of what you could call socialism for the rich and capitalism red in tooth and claw for everybody else. And I just want to explore this idea of what you could call socialism for the rich, or welfare for the rich, or whatever you want to call it. Another example is housing benefit. Now, we spend £23 billion now of taxpayers' money on housing benefit. That's gone up by £2 billion alone under this government. And the reality of housing benefit, and again, this is what's never talked about in the mainstream press, that's not lining the pockets of the tenants, it's lining the pockets of wealthy landlords who are charging extortionate rents because they know you and I, the taxpayer, will step in and subsidise those rents. So now, 1 in 6 of us have private landlords. The reason for that is because successive governments stopped building council housing. So we now have 5 million people languishing on social housing waiting lists. The number of families with kids who are forced to privately rent has doubled in just 5 years. Now, because of that, we've seen a huge increase in the number of people who are claiming or having to claim private housing benefit, or what we should relabel landlord subsidy. So from 2002 till the time New Labour were actually beaten out of office, the number of people in London alone claiming housing benefit in the private rented sector went up by 100,000, 100,000 to 250,000. So that was a huge increase in the number of people who just couldn't afford to pay their rents, with their landlords knowing that you and I would end up stepping in. The same principle applies to tax credits. Now, they're a lifeline for millions of people. But again, let's be clear, they're a subsidy for low pay because bosses aren't paying their workers properly. So again, from 2003 to 2010, the number of families who were claiming, working families claiming tax credits, went up by 50%. The reason for that is even before the crash began, people's pay packets were already flatlining. So from 2004 onwards, which is 4 years before Lehman Brothers came crashing down, if you're in the bottom half, then your income in real terms was flatlining, and if you're in the bottom third, it actually started to decline, even as corporations at the time were posting record profits. So because you didn't have strong trade unions, and because of the form of globalization we have with this global race to the bottom, what happened is, even as they were booming like never before, in real terms they were paying their workers less and less, meaning the state had to step in and top up their wages through tax credits. Now, those are kind of examples, direct examples of benefits, rather than being state benefits which the poorest are scrounging off. It's actually landlords and bosses. Now, another example of socialism for the rich, or welfare for the rich, are the banks, of course. Now, when the banks came crashing down, they weren't allowed to fail or disappear as, I don't know, mining was able to be wiped out, or other industries were wiped out. You and I, the taxpayer, had to step in because of the absolute catastrophic mess the bankers had plunged themselves into. But then again, a crisis of the market was turned into a crisis of public spending, as £500 billion was used to bail them out. Now, this is a really interesting contrast as well between the way people at the bottom and the way people at the top are treated. Because recently we saw the LIBOR scandal, where interest rates were systematically rigged by bankers, for example, in Barclays, in order to make money. Now, that had an impact on millions of people in this country. Now, what's interesting about that is not a single person has been arrested or charged with fraud. And yet, if you look at welfare payments at the moment, we're having ever more punitive sanctions imposed on people if they don't meet very strict requirements. There's one example, just as one example, someone with stomach cancer who missed their interview at the job centre because they were having chemotherapy, and then had their benefits docked as a result. And yet, if you systematically rig LIBOR, even though the banking system helped plunge the whole country into a mess, there is literally no comeback whatsoever. No one is prosecuted as a consequence. Now, another example of this socialism for the rich is the private finance initiative. Now, PFI was a con which was devised originally under John Major's government, but hugely exploded in the New Labour period in order to pay for certain public services. Now, in the NHS, for example, £70 billion of taxpayers' money was used to pay for private contractors for hospital building. The value of those hospitals was just over 11 billion. So now we will end up paying back 70 billion for just over 11 billion pounds worth of hospitals. The way this works is private contractors build public infrastructure and then lease it back to the state. And the reason it's a con is because it originally took those debts off the public debt balance sheet. So that's why it was such a con. It was almost like paying, in practice, for public services on a credit card. Now, what this ended up doing is, as of now, there were 20 NHS hospitals who faced bankruptcy because of this monstrous, scandalous scheme, which people at the time warned about, which New Labour refused to listen to. Other examples of private contractors scrounging off the state. These various welfare to work programmes, many of you will be more than familiar with. One was A4E, which was supposed to get people back to work. Though we've had a number of scandals of people who've actually gone through the system. I spoke to many people myself who ended up working for non-existent companies. But what A4E did is this: their CEO, Emma Harrison, paid herself £8.6 million worth of share dividends. Now, all of the money that A4E have comes from the taxpayer. So all that's happening is she ended up paying herself £8.6 million worth of share dividend at public expense. She even leased her 20-bedroom stately home at the expense of the taxpayer at a cost of £1.7 million. In a broader sense, the £5 billion work programme, which a recent inquiry by MPs found that if it didn't exist, more people would have actually ended up finding work, that has ended up lining not just the pockets of A4E, but many other contractors too. Other private companies who've benefited from taxpayers' money, train companies. We spend now 4 times more taxpayers' money on privatised railways than we did in the time of British Rail. Now, just to show how monstrously inefficient that is, the most efficient railway company that exists in Britain at the moment is East Coast. Now, East Coast railway lines are now at the moment run by the public sector, and because they're doing such a good job, the government has decided to privatise them. Now, another example, NHS. Now, what this government has done since it came to power is, as we all know, started privatising our National Health Service. They didn't actually have the guts to put that to the British people because they know they would have been massacred. It was Nigel Lawson, a Tory Chancellor, who said it was the closest the English had to a religion. Now, many people don't know much about the NHS privatisation because the Health and Social Care Act, which introduced it, is 3 times longer than the original legislation that founded the entire health service in the first place. Now, the problem with that is many sympathetic journalists who instinctively oppose what's happening don't have a clue, and I've asked them, have literally not a clue what the legislation means in practice. Now, in theory, £60 billion worth of taxpayers' money has been handed over to clinical commissioning groups, GPs, in order to run the NHS, but that just turns them into a human shield for privatisers, because in practice, GPs have to do their job, which is sort of looking after patients and that, and instead, private companies will run these commissioning groups instead. Now, under Section 75, as part of this piece of legislation, all NHS services have to be put out to competitive tender unless these groups are satisfied a single provider can deliver that service. Now, the problem is, in theory, how could they be sure there's only one possible service unless they undertake an expensive tender? Because if they don't do that, they're liable to face, legal action for a start. So, as thousands of doctors and nurses have warned in a letter, it will force virtually every part of the English NHS to be open to the private sector. A free-for-all beckons. Now, we've already seen this great sell-off begin. Virgin Care, for example, now run more than 100 NHS services in this country, ranging from radiology departments to GP clinics. Last year, a £100 million contract was handed out to run services in Surrey to Virgin Care. A £130 million contract was given them to run an NHS service for young people in Devon. The problem is, none of us are often aware of this. Because what these private companies do, we don't walk in and see a Virgin Care logo, they all operate under the NHS logo. But the NHS is increasingly turned into a franchise operation where private companies operate under the logo but are hidden from public view. So all of this is an example, all of these are examples of private companies who are literally scrounging off the state. They're being subsidised at public expense, in many cases refusing to pay all but a derisory amount of taxation, and in some cases literally having their profits in entirety paid for them by the taxpayer, and using it in a way which, if in the public sector you ended up, the direct publicly run sector, would end up with Daily Mail headlines in the most hysterical fashion possible. So just quickly, what do we do about this? There's lots of individual things we can talk about, like clamping down on tax avoidance, for example. Richard Murphy, a chartered accountant many of you may be aware of, he runs the Tax Justice Network. He's drawn up a piece of legislation which would clamp down on all forms of tax avoidance. We'd hike taxes on the wealthiest. People then scream, oh, hang on a minute, they'll all flee abroad. But it was interesting because there's been a few studies that have looked at this. One of them by John Shaw, who's Director of State Fiscal Studies at Washington Centre on Budget and Policy Priorities, and he said the whole thing was a myth. You didn't have people fleeing to escape higher taxes. Things like weather were more important, or standard of living, or what sort of bars are there. Those sorts of things were more important than the level of tax. Another former US Federal Reserve economist said, I don't hear many billionaires moving to Moscow. In fact, the only example which we've all heard wheeled out is Gerard Depardieu. Why don't they all go to Jamaica? I think their tax rate there is about 10%. So that tax flight, these studies were looked at in detail and couldn't find detailed evidence for. There were other specific examples too. Housing. Well, instead of subsidising billions of pounds worth of taxpayers' money on housing benefit, we should be letting councils build, giving them the freedom to build. That would pay for itself as they get a secure supply of rent coming in. It'd also create jobs and stimulate the economy, bringing down the welfare bill still further as people stop needing unemployment benefits. The same goes for tax credits. If we had a living wage, we wouldn't be spending billions of pounds on tax credits. The banks, well, we should actually have public control of the banks. They should be nationalised and turned into a public investment bank. Instead of having our public services privatised and sold off, instead we should have democratic control of those services, so giving people who use those services and their workers control of those services rather than handing them out to these private vultures circling. These are all individual responses, but there's a broader response, because all of these things are symptomatic of one thing. They're of a kind of triumphalism that has set in over the last 3 decades, because the people at the top have waged an all-out class war against working people, and it's got to the point where the balance of wealth and power has shifted so dramatically to the people at the top that you end up in a situation where even the National Health Service ends up being sold off to private profit. So that's where we come in. What we need above all else, the real answer to this, the scroungers at the top, is to build a countervailing pressure to the power that they exercise. And what that means is building a broad movement. Now, unsurprisingly, I'm going to shoehorn the People's Assembly into that. But the point of that is this. For the last 3 decades, much of it has been a story of retreat, of the labour movement going backwards, of many of the gains which people fought for, with huge struggle and sacrifice being stripped away by the people at the top. What there needs, of course, is a change to that dynamic by us going on the offensive. So the point of the People's Assembly is to bring together unions representing workers, millions of workers in the private and public sector, activists representing unemployed people, disabled people, young people, elderly people, people with no political home, people in the Labour Party, Green Party and so on, to build that countervailing pressure which actually, if you like, drags the people with power in a different direction. Now, it was Frederick Douglass, and I often use this, so people will have heard this quote several times if you heard me babble before, but it is my favourite quote, which is, "Power conceives nothing without demand. It never did, and it never will." And the idea is the only way you change things in society, the only the way you stop the people at the top shredding all the things you've won in the past, is by organising from below around a set of demands. And that's what the People's Assembly's got to do. So in a sense, all the things I've just spoken about, this idea of people scrounging at the top, is just a class war. And it's interesting because when you stand up for the bottom 70%, they call you a class warrior. You stand up for the people at the top and they call you a moderate. The reality is, it is those at the top who've been waging a class war. And if they accuse us of a class war, then our response is quite simple. You did start it. So we've got to, in that sense, all of these things I've spoken about are things which should anger us, but they should galvanise us to show that we should run society in a different way. And the only way we can do that is by building that broad movement, uniting superficially disparate people who all have the shared same common interest to make sure that the real scroungers are made to cough up and to reorder society in the interests of working people and all those currently being made to pay for this crisis. We can't have lefty days out. We've done them before, and they're all well and good to show maybe the depth of anger or depth of feeling, but in of themselves, obviously, they don't change society. And I think that's the trap this has to avoid. So the whole point, and this comes on a bit to something else I think Lauren said, which is about kind of what we've been talking about, these meetings across the country. Well, the whole point is to try and get local groups set up where people can organise themselves in their own localities, in their own towns and cities. And basically us turning up is just a prompt to get people in the room to hear Mark Steele do what is inarguably a hilarious indictment of capitalism, but at the same time then go use that by having so many people in a room to get together and set up the local groups, set their own campaign priorities locally, whether it be, I don't know, workers' rights or cuts to services or, you know, libraries or whatever, which they themselves can decide on. So it's about having that grassroots movement across the country. And in Manchester, for example, 800 people turned up. We had over 300 in Brighton yesterday, 400 in Sheffield, hundreds more in Newcastle, elsewhere. Now, what they did in, for example, Nottingham and Brighton yesterday is they used the event to have workshops. So we had a load of workshops yesterday where people would organise their own priorities, debate certain things. And that's what we're going to be having on the June 22nd. It won't be a load of top tables. Sam can clarify this at the end as well. He's putting his hand up, maybe to clarify. But the whole day will actually be based around those workshops to actually get people organised. But above all else is to have these local groups set up right across the country who can organise activities and events themselves and have the control and power to do that. So I hope it will be very devolved. So it won't be this top-down centralised monstrosity which will be just composed of having the odd rally where everyone claps and goes home. We can't do that, and that's not how we change things. So I hope the idea of June 22nd is it will be a launch pad. It will be a show of force. It will be all of these events in each of these cities already, and I don't think we should understate how important this is. All of the ones we've been to are the biggest anti-austerity meetings in each of those cities since the crisis began. So we've already had a wave of the biggest anti-austerity meetings since Lehman Brothers came crashing down. The one obviously in London will be by far the biggest yet, and that will be used as a launch pad to get all the local groups set up across the country. So that's how we're going to get the momentum going. It is a launch pad, and we'll be having yet more tours right across the country as well to try and just to encourage local groups to be set up. Lauren, this idea, can we reform, where's Lauren gone? There you are, sorry, hello. Can we reform the system? Well, look, I mean, my view, I'm a democratic socialist. I want a society run by working people in the interests of working people, and that's based on a society operating on the basis of social need rather than private profit, extending democracy to every sphere of life, not just obviously politics, but also, which I'll comment on to in a minute, the workplace and the economy. That's my idea of a democratic socialist society, putting it in the kind of broadest possible terms. Now, how we go about in doing that? Well, my view is you mobilise people from below in their workplaces and their communities. I think I might upset a few people, but there is, and I'm the son of a militant full-timer who's a South Yorkshire organiser for the militant, and the traditional model of the militant and other groups was basically, let's try and have a carbon copy of the October Revolution, which happened in a semi-feudal country, 100 years ago, and nearly a century ago, and has never been replicated in the same way in a single country elsewhere. We've had other revolutions which claim the mantle, but in no way bore much relation in many fundamental ways to what happened. So do I think the way we're going to change things is to have, I don't know, a vanguard party and a kind of revolutionary overthrow with workers' councils across the country? I struggle in theory, I struggle in truth to see that, and as I say, it hasn't, with a few exceptions. In Hungary in 1956, for example, you haven't had those sorts of revolutions take place. And I think in different countries it will always differ. I mean, Venezuela is an example. People again might differ on this. I went to Venezuela in October. Now I think that's a revolutionary transformation that took place. And it wasn't just someone getting elected, but it was actually people in the workplace organising and taking control of their workplaces democratically. Now I'm not saying it'll be like Venezuela, it'd be ridiculous. It's a Latin American country several thousand miles away. It's a completely different society, and that's the point. The truth is, I don't know how a change to, getting rid of capitalism in this country will take place. That is the aim. For me, I guess, just now is starting where people are, and it's because the left is so weak, because the left was almost wiped out as a coherent mass force in this country, because political consciousness is so low still, even though there is this huge amount of anger at what's happened because of this crisis that does get misdirected at people's neighbours. We have to start where people are, and that's just by addressing people's basic bread and butter issues. And by doing that, we can create space for more radical ideas and maybe a more radical movement. But for me, it's just getting people to oppose austerity and having a coherent alternative to that. And then that is a building block, hopefully, to other possibilities, maybe. Lawrence, that point, where's Lawrence gone? Oh, hello, sorry, maybe I should write down where people are. It's pathetic. But, well, touring the country, loads of stuff has come up. I mean, it depends on the city and place, and we've had, what's brilliant about it, have activists themselves representing disabled people, for example, talking about their experiences of ATOS, working people whose pay is being slashed, people who've fought to save their libraries. So it's been quite disparate, lots of different things, and that's what's been so empowering about it for the people who've turned up to these events. Because often when you're involved in a struggle, it can feel a bit like you're being picked off one by one. You're quite isolated. And just by turning up in a room with lots of other people who are basically being screwed over in very different ways, that's empowering, because you think, oh, hang on a minute, I can actually link up my struggles to the struggles of other people, and I'm in a far better position if I do that to actually fight back and win. So I think that's what's cropped up, and that's why these local groups are so important, because they link together the coalition of people who are all in this together, to coin a phrase. Democratically run services, I'm glad you brought that up. The old model, people talk about nationalisation, which was introduced under the Labour governments after 1945. The form of nationalisation we had was actually designed by Herbert Morrison, who's Peter Mandelson's granddad. Now, this form of nationalisation is top-down public corporations run by bureaucrats, no involvement of workers and the people who use those services. So I'd like a new democratic model of workers' control, but also involving people who use the services. Take the railways. Now, obviously, I want them brought back into public control, but not the old style under British Rail. I'd like a management board where you have, for example, and this is something the RMT have suggested, a third going to workers, a third going to representatives of passengers, and then the third going to the government. And the idea then is they work together for the interest of railways, also broader society. I think that's a model which could be applied elsewhere, and that's the democratisation of our services. And we could just nick the rhetoric of the right, modernising our services, bringing them into the 21st century and so on, which doesn't mean retreating to 19th century Victorian economics and selling them off to bastards. Right, Anthony, where's Anthony? Yeah, this point about populism and UKIP, I think it's really interesting because, I mean, UKIP were a complex force, actually. I looked, before the surge, I looked at the profile of a UKIP voter in the opinion polls. This is weird, this will sound odd. They're less likely to support cuts than Tory voters. They're less likely to support cuts to benefits than Tory voters. They're not necessarily just easily portrayed, if you like, as the hard right or uber Thatcherite wing of the Tories. They're more complex than that, and they appeal to people for different reasons. The way they've got away with it, obviously their central appeal is directing people's anger away from the people at the top to immigrants. As we all know, it's this idea, the reason your pay packet's been flatlining isn't because of weak trade unions, it isn't because of the form of globalisation, it's because of a bunch of Poles who come over and, picking strawberries. Those sorts of ideas have been used by UKIP to win people's support. And what's interesting about it, because it's a false populism, because if anyone looks at their actual policies, they're as pro-elite as it's possible to be. They support putting, I don't know, teachers, well, cutting the taxes of millionaires, giving them a paycheck far bigger than anything the Tories want to do, and then sticking them in the same tax bracket as teachers, as dinner ladies, as call centre workers. I mean, that's something we need to make abundantly clear. They want to sack 2 million public sector workers, which is about a third of public sector workers, which means quite a few fewer doctors and nurses. They think climate change is one big massive hoax. I mean, these are all things which actually people who were voting for them, many of them, even though their anger is being misdirected against immigrants, would probably go, you know, they'd be horrified. And I think that's one thing that could be exposed. But you're right, what's happened, I think, partly with UKIP, in brutal honesty, is a damning indictment of us on the left. Because they filled a vacuum. They adopt this anti-establishment posture, and they've directed people's anger, because there's huge amounts of anger out there, and they've directed it at the wrong targets. That should have been us directing people's anger at the right targets. And we failed to do that. And as a result, a populist right has come in, and that's why we have to change in a way. We have to be, when we use the word populist, it can be a derogatory term, but we have to communicate in a way which actually resonates with people. I mean, the way people outside the political bubble think isn't in terms of left and right, it's in terms of issues that have to be addressed, housing or wages or services. And the way you win people over is by addressing them in a way that is coherent and convincing, that relates to people's experiences, that's communicated in their language. That's what the left just has to learn to do. Yeah, I should stop, so I'm just babbling on. And finally, well, Simon, just quickly, the point you make about Tunbridge Wells. I'm glad you brought this up, actually. I did any questions, it's the Radio 4 version of Question Time a while ago, and I was dreading it, because I had to go to Surrey, where was it? Surrey, Farnham in Surrey. And I was like, well, I'm going to get massacred. I'm just going to think, it's this prepubescent looking trot frothing away on a panel. And it was like during the PCS threatened border strike. And then 2 days before I went on, I was going on with Kelvin Mackenzie, who's, I think, the worst person who's ever lived. And I had to ring the Hills for Justice campaign and he said, do you want me to do this? But I thought, oh, so what's going to happen is I'm going to go on, attack Kelvin Mackenzie, I'm going to get crucified, and then I'm going to go on about the PCS strike, and that is it, I'll probably just be burned alive. But the reality was, I got a really good response. A really good response, one of the best responses I've ever got from an audience. And that shows, again, if you try and communicate in a way which resonates with people, because why do people, lower middle class people who read the Daily Mail, why do they want people at the top not paying their taxes? These are people who depend on state-run services, whether they like it or not, like the NHS or state education. These are people whose their income has been flatlining or declining whilst it remains boom time for the people at the top. I mean, when we talk about middle class, often it is working class people in denial, if you like. It's this idea of, you know, I get away by pulling myself up by my bootstraps. If I listen to Radio 4 and read a broadsheet or the Daily Mail, then I'm not somehow working class. And that's something we have to combat. We don't have to use working class, you can fudge it, use working people, or the 99% whatever, but we can unite or win over people who we think actually we almost write off as the left. And we can do that by appealing to people on an issue by issue basis. So yeah, let's win over the, you know, the Socialist Republic of Tunbridge Wells.
If you've already put your hand up, can you put it up again, because I've probably forgotten. Okay, there's a hand there.
Yeah, my name's Des. I want to come back to, I can't speak about Tunbridge Wells, but...
And at the back as well, you could leave.
Okay. So that's everything. Owen now has 5 minutes to come
Okay,
back.
so I'll just go quickly, just steam through those. These were fantastic contributions, really. I always find these meetings really useful myself, as I hope you all do, just because we learn from each other, we share experiences and ideas, and we think of angles that we might not have covered ourselves. So I'm very grateful for that, and I hope you're all grateful for that from each other. I mean, just to go through some of those quickly, this idea of, I think, relating outside the lefty bubble is a very, very important point to make. And I think sometimes where the left falls down is we end up self-ghettoising, we end up just hanging out probably a bit too much with each other and forgetting that people out there don't quite always think in quite the same way as we do, and that has an impact on how we communicate. And that means the sort of vocabulary we use. I mean, we started talking about, you know, strategies of resistance. Well, I suppose resistance is the sort of word we just shouldn't use as an example, because most people listen to that and go, oh, God, what are you suggesting? We're going to go into the hills and take up arms or something. And I mean, the point is we've got to find ways of translating radical ideas into common sense ideas. That's what the right do so well. They get what actually are very radical, often extreme, free market ideas, and they translate it into a way which resonates with people's everyday experiences. I mean, one way they talk about the deficit, for example, is they compare the deficit to a household budget. And that always resonates with people, because people think, hang on a minute, if I'm in debt, it doesn't make any sense to borrow more money to get myself out of the mess. It makes no economic sense whatsoever, as any serious economist would tell you, because if you caught young Danny's pocket money, his mum's not going to lose his job as a result. You know, they don't have a printing machine in their house which is injecting quantitative easing throughout their household. I mean, that's the point, because in an economy we're all dependent on each other, in your earnings are my earnings and so on. If I cut back on what I spend, then you lose out as well. But it doesn't matter, because that story connects with people. And we need stories too. I'm not saying we should just make them up necessarily. No, we shouldn't make them up. But having stories that resonate with people's everyday lives is important. It's the same with unemployment. We need to use examples of Costa Coffee opening up a shop, a whole, 650 people applying for one job, or talk about our own families and friends desperately looking for work that doesn't exist, sending in, 50 CVs a week and not getting anything back. Using those sorts of stories to communicate what's actually happening, rather than what I often end up myself doing, which is you just rely on facts and statistics that don't connect with people. George Lakoff, the US political linguist, always makes that point. The right often use stories, the left use facts and statistics, but people connect better with stories. So we've got to avoid using jargon, basically left-wing jargon, and just use the sorts of words that people use in their everyday lives. Without patronising people. People aren't stupid. People understand complex ideas without you putting them to the lowest common denominator. But it is about just translating it to language in a world where the left's been very weak for a very long time. So that's an important point, I think, to make. You make the point about dropping the word left. We just don't need to bung those sorts of words into sentences all the time. I have a problem with progressive, because it's the most meaningless word in the English language. George Osborne uses the word progressive. So I think just, we don't even have to talk about that. We talk about, why is it fair they get all this money, or they're not paying their taxes. And that's the point about populism, coming down to that, or the Daily Mail of the left. You say, why are these, you're paying your taxes, you work hard day in and day out, you can't afford an army of lawyers and accountants, why should they get away with not paying their taxes when you're struggling to make ends meet? It's quite simple. I mean, you just make it in those terms. You don't have to put it in a complex way. I mean, that is sometimes a problem on the left, I find, which is almost going out of our way to put things in the most complicated, highfalutin way possible. And it's self-defeating, in my view. And I think that kind of hyper-intellectual way of communicating is bad. In terms of reaching out to people, like, as you say, in your, get your name at Joni, yeah, take your ex-mining village. I mean, this is the problem as well, again. I mean, often it's a very London-based left as well. That's why this People's Assembly is so important about going all over the country. And I'd like us to get out the big cities as well and go to communities like that. Why not go to Ashington in Northumberland? It used to be the biggest mining village in the country. I've been there. It's a country which is still devastated by the collapse of those pits. Let's go there and try and get groups set up there and let people organise there, for example, rather than just sticking to Manchester and London and basically just mobilising people who already somehow on the left. I do think myself from these meetings that lots of the people coming to them aren't people who've had any political involvement at all. People who came up to me at the end of the meeting kept saying, I've never been to a political meeting in my life. So I do think we're reaching outside that bubble. But that has got to be our aim, basically. We're not just trying to rejuvenate or bring together the existing fragments of the left. That's a pointless exercise. We have to be reaching outside that bubble as best we can. Chris, the point you make about, the opinion polls point, is he gone, Chris?
Yeah.
He's lagged it. Fine. But I'll give you an example just in terms of how complex it is actually, and how it's possible to win, well, just how kind of pervasive what we might regard as left-wing ideas are. I'll give you this example, one set of voters. So this set of voters, their preferred option for the railways is renationalisation. Over 40% of them want a 75% tax on people who earn £1 million or more. And the majority of them oppose the scrapping of the 50p tax. I'm talking about Conservative voters. That's the point though. It's more complicated, and people even though you might just write them off as that's the left or the right, people can have an incredible ability to have a whole set of apparently contradictory ideas at any one given time. And that's my point about winning people over on an issue-by-issue basis. You don't see people as a block of left-wingers, a block of right-wingers. You see people who you can win over on an issue-by-issue basis, on the basis that even if they're reading the Daily Mail, they're pissed off about people not paying their taxes. They don't want the local library being closed down. They don't like the fact their pay packet's shrinking. You can win people over just by doing that. The point, just quickly, the students' movement. Look, the students' movement was, in itself, a huge step forward, because it was a real catalyst, actually, for all the forms of people fighting back we actually saw. Because before the students went on that historic demonstration in November 2010, when 52,000 people came on the streets and realised, in many cases for the first time, their own sense of power, if you like, that, blimey, we've all turned up. People were almost a bit frightened by how much power they have. They were taken aback on that day. But actually, that was a catalyst, because you had that wave of occupations. I took part in the UCL occupation over there, those waves of demonstrations, but it gave other people hope and confidence and courage. And lots of trade unionists would come out and say, if they can do it, why can't we? And it's one of the reasons the March 26th demo in 2011 was so big. It gave hope to the people who went on strike, like the biggest strike that took place since 1926 in November 2011. All of those people actually, all of that was kick-started by the students going out. I think where it failed, in my view, and not everyone will agree, but I don't think movements can be sustained over a long period unless they have a coherent alternative for them to rally around. And I think because the student movement lacked that, it fizzled out. Being a student is a transient thing. You're only a student for a little while. We're not all young, believe it. I'm still I look like a 12-year-old, but I'm 30 next year. Youth is a transient category. There's almost sometimes this cult of youth. It's young people who will change the world. And whilst it's true, it's often students who move first, because students don't necessarily have families they have to look after. They're not bogged down with, many students do have jobs, but full-time careers or whatever. Often they're the first, most sensitive to periods of crisis, and will be the first to come out on the streets for various reasons. But it's not enough. They have to be part of a much larger movement, and that's the point of linking people together. I just want to end up, because I think we're running out of time, but the point is this. The way we get change isn't just by people being angry, because there's lots of anger out there, and there's lots of fear. People realise that their kids are going to be poorer than them for the first time since World War II. That sense of optimism which existed even not that long ago, that, my kids at least will be better off than me, however tough things are, that's dead. And that is that realisation sitting in. But it doesn't matter how angry or scared people are, people don't fight back without hope. Now that's the point. Harvey Milk in the 1970s, many of you will know Harvey Milk, I'm sure, crusading civil rights campaign and politician, and he said, I know you cannot live on hope alone, but without it life is not worth living. And the point is, unless you have hope as well as anger, you give up. People just rant at their television sets. All that anger gets redirected against their neighbours. And that's the two things. Tony Benn says this, it's the flame of anger and the flame of hope that makes social change possible. So that's what we've got to do. We've got to tap into people's anger, but give people hope that you can change society. We can have a coherent alternative to what's happening. Otherwise people go, this sucks. This is really bad. I'm getting poorer year on year. There's no end in sight. My community's really getting a pummeling, but there's no alternative. We've got to pay down the debts and the deficit in this way, and these cuts have to be made. We've got to have that coherent alternative to give people the confidence to resist. And that is where I think the People's Assembly will come in. It will give a voice to people otherwise airbrushed out of existence. But it will push a coherent alternative that gives people that hope. And I'm optimistic. It is possible, I'm sure we'll all agree, to take on power. That's what UK and CUP put tax avoidance on the agenda by struggling. The poll tax movement not only got rid of the poll tax, helped beat Margaret Thatcher out of power. I've had countless examples. Leeds bin strikers who took on their council when it tried to cut their wages by a third, and they won. The electricians who took on Balfour Beatty, and they won. It is possible to win. And that's what we've always got to be ourselves aware of. And then we go out to our communities, we tell them there is this coherent alternative. we give them, try and link them into this movement, we try and put these ideas in a way they understand. And if we do that, we can build a mass movement that not only takes on this government, not only takes on austerity, that actually fights for a society run by working people in the interests of working people. So I think let's start doing that. This weekend's a great contribution to that, but I hope everyone gets stuck into the People's Assembly and let's fight back. Thank you.